In a city divided by wealth, status, and power, the followers of Christ became one family. They gathered in homes to break bread. They prayed in unity. They shared not only their faith, but their possessions. Men and women who owned land and houses sold them, bringing the money to the apostles to distribute among the needy. It was a fellowship without selfishness, a communion that mirrored the very heart of Christ. To the outside world, it was incomprehensible. To the faithful, it was evidence that heaven had come near. Among these generous acts stood the example of a man named Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus. The apostles called him Barnabas, meaning son of encouragement. He sold a field he owned and brought the entire amount to the apostles. His act was pure, his offering complete, his devotion unquestionable. The church rejoiced. The name of Barnabas was honored not because he sought recognition, but because his heart aligned with the Spirit of God. His offering was a sweet fragrance, a testimony of true surrender. His sacrifice set a standard of sincerity that inspired many. But where there is light, shadows always linger. And even within this movement of purity and power, the seeds of deception began to stir. In the gathering of believers stood a couple named Ananias and Sapphira. They too witnessed the glory of the church. They too desired to be numbered among the faithful. But their hearts were not entirely surrendered. They longed for the honor given to Barnabas, yet they were unwilling to make the same sacrifice. They decided to sell a piece of property. Outwardly, it appeared to be an act of devotion, a contribution to the growing movement. But within their hearts, calculation replaced purity. They conspired together, choosing to hold back part of the money while pretending to give the full amount. To men, it seemed clever. To heaven, it was rebellion. For the issue was not the money itself, but the deception, the attempt to appear holy while concealing dishonesty. The sin was not in withholding, but in pretending, not in possession, but in hypocrisy. The Spirit of God that filled the church was holy, pure, and unyielding. This was the dawn of a new covenant, a sacred era where God dwelt not in temples made by human hands, but in the hearts of his people. It was a foundation being laid with fire, a holy sanctuary in which truth was the cornerstone. And into that holy fire, Ananias and Sapphira carried falsehood. What they did not understand was that in this fragile moment of history, the integrity of the church was at stake. If deception were tolerated, if hypocrisy were allowed to take root, the entire foundation of this new fellowship could be corrupted. The stage was set for a divine confrontation. What was about to happen would shake not only the couple who conspired in secrecy, but the entire body of believers. The fear of God would fall like a storm, and the holiness of the Spirit would be revealed in a way that no one could forget. For God had decided that the first attempt to corrupt his church would not go unpunished. The time of testing had come, and judgment was at the door. The gathering of believers had grown to thousands, spreading across the streets and homes of Jerusalem. Day by day, the apostles performed signs and wonders. The sick were carried out into the streets on mats, that even Peter's shadow might fall on them. Multitudes from surrounding towns brought their afflicted, and they were all healed. The movement was unstoppable, not by the power of man, but by the Spirit of God. Fear and reverence mingled with awe, for it was clear that the church was not built by human effort, but by divine presence. The people felt it in their bones, the holiness that walked among them, the fire that burned unseen but undeniable. But within the beauty of this unity, darkness quietly formed. Ananias and Sapphira had watched Barnabas give generously. They had seen the respect and honor it brought him. They too wanted such recognition, yet without the same sacrifice. They decided to sell a possession, a piece of land that could fetch a great sum. When the silver coins were poured out before them, their hearts wavered. The weight of the money, the glimmer of its promise, the fear of losing security, these things gripped them. and rather than surrender all, they kept back a portion. But their mistake was not in keeping it. The sin was deeper, more poisonous. They agreed together to present the lesser amount as if it were the whole. They chose appearance over truth, reputation over integrity, image over reality. It was the first mask ever worn in the church, the birth of hypocrisy among the holy. In the quiet of their home, the decision was sealed. What seemed small in their eyes was monumental before heaven. They were not merely deceiving men, but attempting to deceive the Spirit of the living God. Meanwhile, the atmosphere among the believers was charged with purity. Every gift given was seen as holy, every act of generosity as worship. The apostles, filled with the Spirit, carried a heavy awareness of God's holiness. And into this environment, Ananias carried his offering. The contrast was striking. Others came in humility, trembling with awe as they laid their gifts at the apostles' feet. Their faces reflected sincerity, their sacrifices genuine. But Ananias approached with pretense, concealing the truth under the cloak of devotion. The moment he placed his gift before the apostles, heaven responded. What no man could see, the Spirit revealed. For God's eyes search the heart, no secret is hidden from him. Judgment was not delayed. In an instant, Ananias fell to the ground, lifeless. His body lay before the assembly as a chilling testimony that God is not mocked. The room was seized with terror. Those who had seen the signs and wonders of healing now witnessed a sign of judgment. For the same Spirit that raised the dead could also strike down the deceiver. Young men stepped forward, wrapped his body, and carried him out to be buried. The congregation was shaken to its core. Fear gripped all who heard of it, spreading across Jerusalem like a storm. But the story was not finished. For hours later, Sapphira, unaware of what had happened, entered the gathering. She carried herself with the same mask of pretense, the same secret pact. She did not know that heaven had already exposed their deception. The moment of reckoning drew near. This was not just about a husband and wife. This was about the holiness of God confronting the first attempt to defile his church. It was a declaration for all generations that the Spirit of God cannot be deceived, that the church is not a place for appearances, but for truth. And just as Ananias had fallen, so too would the weight of judgment rest upon Sapphira. What was unfolding was more than an isolated tragedy. It was a divine warning, a line drawn in fire. From this moment forward, every believer would understand that the presence of God among them was not casual, not to be treated lightly. The Spirit was holy, and those who dared to lie in his presence would not escape. The fear of God was about to reach its peak. The sin was hidden no longer. The mask of hypocrisy was about to be torn away. The atmosphere within the assembly was thick with fear. The sudden death of Ananias had shaken everyone to their core. This was not a sickness, not an accident, not a natural end of life. It was judgment, swift, undeniable, and holy. A man had lied not to men but to God, and heaven had answered. The story spread like fire across Jerusalem. Whispers carried through the marketplaces, echoed in the courtyards, and stirred among the temple courts. The followers of the Way had already been known for miracles, but now they were marked by something even more terrifying: holiness that demanded truth. Hours passed. The believers still trembled, their hearts caught between awe and dread. They had seen healings, deliverances, and conversions, but never had they seen the God of purity act with such finality within their very midst. Then came the sound of footsteps. Sapphira entered the gathering, her face calm, her heart still wrapped in the agreement she and her husband had made. She carried no awareness of what had already happened. She walked among the assembly as though she were just another worshiper, her presence cloaked in the confidence of deceit. But heaven was watching. The Spirit of God, who had seen her husband's lie, now searched her heart. She stood in the holy presence of the same fire, a fire that could not be tricked or contained. The unseen reality weighed in the air, the holiness of God against the falsehood of man. For hypocrisy does not merely offend, it corrupts, infects, and spreads if left unchallenged. And God, in His wisdom, was not going to allow His newborn church to be poisoned at its root. The silence of eternity seemed to fall upon the room. What had begun in secrecy was now exposed before heaven. The mask could not remain. The moment of judgment had arrived, and then it happened. As suddenly as her husband before her, Sapphira fell to the ground, her body lifeless, struck by the same hand of justice. There was no delay, no chance for pretense to linger, no time for deception to spread. She too was carried out, buried beside her husband. The scene was unforgettable. The early church had been marked forever, not by wealth, not by power, not by influence, but by holiness. Great fear gripped the entire assembly. And not only those within, but everyone in Jerusalem who heard of it trembled. The story was retold again and again, spreading beyond the city walls. This was no ordinary death. This was heaven's announcement that the Spirit of God was present among His people, and His presence demanded truth. It was a warning not only for that generation, but for all who would come after. God had made it clear from the very beginning, His church was not a stage for performance, not a place to polish appearances, not a platform for man's pride. It was the dwelling place of the living God, and to lie within it was to court destruction. From that day forward, reverence settled over the believers like a cloak. They gathered still, they worshipped still, but they did so with trembling hearts. Every offering given, every word spoken, every act of service carried a new weight. The awareness of God's holiness was sharper than ever before. And yet, in the midst of fear, the Spirit did not withdraw. Miracles continued, conversions multiplied, the gospel spread like wildfire, but this time, it spread with a shadow, an ever-present reminder that the God who healed the sick was also the God who judged sin. The people of Jerusalem looked upon the followers of Christ with awe. They dared not join them casually, for they knew this movement was not built on human strength, but on divine fire. Still, countless men and women came, drawn by the undeniable truth of a holy God at work. The death of Ananias and Sapphira was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first great shaking of the church, a shaking that purified, refined, and established a foundation that could not be destroyed. And for generations to come, their story would echo as a living testimony that God is not mocked, that His Spirit cannot be deceived, and that His church is set apart. It was the day holiness became a witness. It was the day hypocrisy was buried. And it was the day the fear of the Lord ignited a spiritual awakening that could not be silenced. The account of Sapphira's fall carried a weight that words could barely contain. If the death of Ananias had left the church shaken, the sudden collapse of his wife completed the testimony in terrifying fullness. It was no longer possible to explain away what had happened as a coincidence or a natural tragedy. This was deliberate. This was divine. This was judgment from God Himself. Her death was not merely the ending of a life. It was the exposure of a covenant of deceit. Husband and wife had conspired together, building a secret agreement in the shadows, thinking they could present a half-truth as a whole offering. Yet in the holy light of the Spirit, shadows dissolve. The secret they carried between themselves had been shattered before the throne of heaven. The burial was swift. Just as with her husband, young men rose and carried her body away, placing her in the ground beside him. Husband and wife, partners in deceit, were now partners in judgment. Their names would forever be bound to this moment, a living caution carved into the memory of the early church. The community stood in awe, stunned into silence. The dust of their burial still hung in the air when realization settled like a heavy mantle. This was not a story that would fade with time. This was a defining moment, a turning point in the life of the church. Great fear fell on the entire assembly. It was not the fear of persecution, nor the fear of death at the hands of men, but the fear of the living God. This was a fear deeper than trembling at danger. It was the holy reverence that comes when mortals glimpse the consuming fire of divine purity. It was the recognition that the God who had poured out his Spirit in tongues of fire still burned with holiness that no man could tame. From that day forward, the believers approached worship differently. Every prayer, every offering, every act of fellowship carried a sacred weight. No longer could anyone come lightly, as though the gathering of saints were ordinary. They understood that to step into the fellowship of the Spirit was to step into holy ground. The fear spread beyond their circle. Outsiders looked at them with wonder and unease. Reports of the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira circulated in the streets of Jerusalem, whispered in the marketplaces, debated in the temple courts. Some scoffed, others trembled. But none could deny that something beyond human power had taken place. And though fear kept many from joining casually, still the numbers of true believers multiplied. For while judgment had fallen, grace was still being poured out. Miracles did not cease. The sick were healed, the possessed were delivered, and the broken found hope. The same Spirit who struck down the hypocrites lifted up the humble and drew thousands into the embrace of salvation. This was the paradox that defined the early church. Judgment and mercy, fire and healing, fear and joy intertwined. Holiness was no longer a concept, but a reality they had seen with their own eyes. It was a reality they could never again forget. The name of Ananias and Sapphira became a warning through the generations. Their story was not hidden, not softened, not erased. It was told again and again as a testimony that God is not mocked, that deceit has no place in his presence, and that the church is his holy dwelling. In the years that followed, the memory of that day shaped the identity of the early believers. They were not a social club, not a human organization, not a gathering of convenience. They were a body sanctified by the Spirit, a temple made not with stone but with living hearts. And within that temple, truth was demanded. The fall of Ananias and Sapphira was more than a tragedy. It was a safeguard. It was a boundary drawn at the very birth of the church, a declaration that hypocrisy would not be allowed to take root in the soil of God's people. For if it had, the foundation of the church could have been corrupted before it even began. Instead, their deaths became a purifying flame. They were the stark reminder that the God of grace was also the God of truth, and that his mercy did not make him weak, but holy. And so long after their bodies had returned to the dust, the story lived on. A testimony, a warning, a call to purity. It is a call to integrity, a call to holiness, a call to authenticity in a world drowning in pretense. The church of today, like the church of old, stands at the same crossroads. Will we walk in truth, or will we settle for appearances? Will we give him our all, or will we hold back and pretend? Ananias and Sapphira remind us that there is no middle ground. The Spirit of God is not mocked, but for those who choose truth, there is power, there is awakening, there is revival. For just as judgment fell on hypocrisy, glory fell on sincerity. And the same God who purified his church with fire also filled it with power to turn the world upside down. This is not just their story. It is ours. The sin that shook the early church is still shaking us today, not to destroy us, but to awaken us, not to bury us, but to refine us, not to silence us, but to make us a holy voice in a world longing for truth. Their graves may be silent, but their story still speaks. And it speaks to us now. Walk in truth. Live in holiness. Let your yes be yes and your heart be pure. For the God who walks among his people is still holy, still powerful, still consuming, and still merciful. The church that began in fear ended in fire, and the same fire is waiting for us today.